Great. Thank you so much, Professor Phillips, for your kind introduction, and to Vanessa and Alana for the invitation to be here today, to Dina for helping to arrange my visit. It's really a pleasure always to be in a room with people thinking about health and law and reproduction and gender and race and class. And so I was kind of thinking about how I was going to start this talk on male reproductive health after the election that we've just had in the United States. And I just wanted to say, to all of you lovely people who work in Canadian universities, if you need a professor of sociology who specializes in reproduction, I do all the things: egg and sperm donation, IVF, male reproductive health. I'm only half joking. Seriously, find me afterwards. But I wanted to kind of, we in the United States are really sitting with a deep awareness and fear of just how things were already really bad in terms of access to all kinds of reproductive health and healthcare more generally, how it's so profoundly shaped by all the inequalities that we were just talking about on the last panel. And so the question is, well, why am I going to stand here and talk to you about male reproductive health for the next 35 or 40 minutes? And I do not want to periodize my career in terms of Donald Trump, but I will say that I began this project on male reproductive health prior to his being elected, worked on it all the way through, and am still working on it today. And I continue to think that it is important for the reasons that I began the work in the first place, which is that if we continue to relegate reproduction as a quote unquote women's issue, something that affects only people who can become pregnant or who are pregnant, then I think we've lost. We've lost when it comes to reproductive politics. We've lost when it comes to gender politics and all the other politics that intersect with those. So the research that I'm going to be talking to you about today, I've been doing for about the last 10 years. Let's see, there we go. And resulted first in a book, Gynecology, G-U-Y, Gynecology, about the lack of attention to male reproductive health by biomedical scientists and clinicians, by public health policymakers. And I'm going to argue that we need to pay more attention to male reproductive health, but that leads to a number of really sticky complexities. And so the second book was after I published Gynecology and was thinking about all the different ways that it's really difficult to pay attention to male reproductive health without sort of reifying and reinforcing various problems we have in gender and reproductive politics. I worked with Lisa Campo-Engelstein, who's a bioethicist, and Brian T. Nguyen, who is an OBGYN, an abortion provider, and a male contraception researcher, which I think he might be the only person who combines all three of those things in one human. But so between the three of us, we pulled together 30 scholars across social sciences, humanities, legal scholars, we had psychologists, there were physicians, adolescent medicine folks, and urologists. It was really, really diverse group of people who had been thinking about sperm in various ways. And we asked them to write essays about what do they think are the most pressing issues at the intersection of sperm, health, and politics in the US as of April 2023. And so we met, we discussed, and those essays all got revised based on those interdisciplinary discussions. And that book is coming out in June from NYU Press. So I will be kind of giving you a little bit of the sociological and historical research, and then pulling a little bit from the work that we did on that book in order to talk about how to address some of these complexities. So I'm going to begin my discussion just because I'm not totally sure who's in the room and how familiar you are with social scientific approaches to reproduction. So I think many of you are deeply familiar with what I'm about to say, so I'll go quick. But just in case we have any kind of newer arrivals to this field, I want to situate this discussion of male reproductive health in a broader social scientific discussion about reproduction, which involves, as we see in this room, sociologists, anthropologists, historians, political scientists, legal scholars, who think and study how reproduction is both fundamentally biological and fundamentally social, right? Immediately hooking us into classic debates about the relationship between bodies and societies, nature, nurture, et cetera. And so about 10 years ago, I published a review article in the Annual Review of Sociology, in which I sort of surveyed the literature at that time, primarily focused on the US, primarily focused on qualitative research to not duplicate other annual reviews that had been written. And it was in reading the literature for the purposes of writing that sort of started to realize that those of us in the world of reproduction kind of think about reproduction in three different buckets. So efforts by individuals to have children, which involve conception, pregnancy, and birth. Efforts by people to not have children, which involves contraception, abortion, sterilization. And then efforts by people who are trying to have children, infertility, assisted reproduction, and adoption. And in sort of figuring out that those were the sort of the implicit categories, I think, that we were operating with, I also observed that they're pretty siloed, right? And even in this conference, we're all here in the room, but they've been siloed into different panels. And so the argument that I make in this article is that if actually we took more of a life course approach to reproductivity and thought about people as they sort of may move in and out of these different categories. People who are trying not to have children, then they're trying to have children. They have the children they want, and then they're trying to parent them to bring in the reproductive justice approach, right? That we could sort of think about the relationships between all of these different social and biological processes in different ways than we currently do. So I will refer you to that article if you want to read more, but this was the definition of reproduction that I came up with as a result of doing that reading. So reproduction is the biological and social process of having or not having children, okay? And then I pulled on a metaphor actually that shows up in Anne Fausto Sterling's classic book on sexing the body. And I argued that we could think about reproduction not only in terms of a life course, as I was just discussing, but also in terms of sort of these nested dolls from the biological level of cells or genes or reproductive organs out to the interactional, the community level, the historical, structural, institutional level. So again, probably not news to anybody in this room, but I offer this because I think this visual really helps with teaching about the politics of reproduction. And one of the things that I really like is the idea that if you change anything at any level, it changes the shapes of the other dolls, right? So if you are, have a community living next to a toxic waste dump, and there's all kinds of genetic and biological ramifications for people's health, that reverberates all the way out to the community, social, institutional levels, right? And vice versa. If we change our laws about access to abortion or contraception or reproductive health, that is going to shape people's bodies, right? So this nested dolls, you can kind of think about it as a dynamic model of change happening at any level is going to affect all the other levels. And then I'll put my little red timeline at the bottom that we can think about this temporally, both in terms of an individual life course or in terms of historical time. All right, so with the nested dolls image in mind, you can think about reproduction, and many of you are thinking about reproduction as a case that is important not only in and of itself, but provides insights into a variety of topics that social scientists and legal scholars really care about, right? And it's only because I'm not good at PowerPoint that looks like a hierarchy here, but think about this as being on its side. I do not put scientific knowledge at the top and people's individual bodily experiences at the bottom, sideways. And so reproduction is a case that gives us insight into all of these areas. And you can also think about all the way, arrows going in between each of these arrows to all of the other ones. So, all right, so those are some of my visuals. And with that, it's sort of around the same time. I'm reviewing this literature. I had finished my first book, which was Sex Cells, thinking about this comparative study of egg donation and sperm donation and trying to figure out what I was going to do with my next project. And I started noticing a series of headlines about the health of male bodies. And so that included factors such as their age, their behaviors, exposures to toxins, how these kinds of exposures for men and paternal aging could damage sperm in such a way that it could potentially affect their children's health. So in 2005, there's sort of a radio personality and urologist, Harry Fish, publishes a book on the male biological clock. In 2012, geneticists published a study showing that with every passing year, men have a greater risk of developing harmful mutations in their sperm that can lead to diseases in their children, such as autism or schizophrenia. That study made the front page of the New York Times. Epidemiologists began warning men who smoked that prior to conception, cigarette smoking could actually cause germline mutations in their sperm that raises their children's risk of cancer, right? So the Mayo Clinic sort of got in on the action, this patient-friendly website, and kind of gave people information about how to grow healthy sperm. And then you have men's health magazines who are mobilizing various tropes of masculinity to communicate some of these new findings, right? So right now, there's not really a term that people agree on to refer to paternal aging, exposures, et cetera, but sometimes you hear paternal effects. I'm sort of advocating for sperm effects to, separate it from the paternal part. But essentially the news, the reason this makes headlines is that it's not just women's behaviors and women's bodies that affect reproductive outcomes, but maternal bodies, male bodies prior to conception. And that includes everything from miscarriage to birth defects, illnesses in childhood, and even adult onset conditions. All right, so my research question for the book was, what took so long, right? After more than a century of asking every possible question about female reproductive health, studying everything that people who are assigned female at birth did in terms of their diet and their smoking and their drinking and the air they breathe, why were we only now in 2005, 2010, 2015, learning basic information about how the health of male bodies mattered for reproductive outcomes? Right? Doesn't make any sense. So my efforts to answer this question are chronicled in Gynecology. They took me back to the 19th century as the medical profession began to specialize. Throughout the 20th century, as I tracked various efforts to bring more attention to the significance of male reproductive health, and eventually to an interview study with contemporary men and how they think about their own reproductivity. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview of the argument that I make in the book. It's essentially an argument about the production of non-knowledge, right? So sociologists, anthropologists, philosophers of science talk a lot about the production of knowledge. This is a study of the production of non-knowledge, right? How do we come to produce ignorance about certain topics? Okay, this is where I get to make a joke about being an expert in ignorance. Yes. Okay. So the book uses the case of male reproductive health to examine the relationship between gendered beliefs about bodies and the making of medical knowledge. And it starts with a puzzle, which is that, you've all heard this story. Women's health activists since the 1970s have made arguments that male bodies were understood and used as a standard body for biomedical research. Most of the 20th century, most medical research was conducted on samples of middle-aged white men with the assumption that the results would generalize to the rest of us. So our general knowledge about health and medicine was really knowledge about male bodies. And it wasn't until the 1990s, in the US at least, that women's health advocates successfully pressure federal agencies like the NIH to require that women be systematically included in medical research and clinical trials. And so the question is, if male bodies have been so central to the making of medical knowledge, how is it that we know so little about their contributions to reproductive outcomes? Okay. And by reproductive outcomes, I just want to be really clear about what I'm including here. So I am talking specifically about how the age, health status, behaviors, and toxic exposures of male bodies can result in effects on sperm and potentially the effects on children's health. Okay. There are many other ways that men can affect reproductive outcomes. They carry heritable genetic mutations. If they smoke around their pregnant partners, intimate partner violence, right? There's other ways that you could think about the effect of men on reproductive outcomes. But here I'm focused, and this made the project doable, specifically on male bodies. Okay. All right. When did we start? Do we know? Just wondering what my time is. Oh, no. Did I ask right as you got up? I'm at 12. Okay, so I should go for, okay, great. Thank you very much. So alongside this long-standing claim, right, we've got male bodies being a standard body, but we don't know anything about their reproductivity. We have an equal long-standing claim in the gender and medicine literature that the female body has been primarily understood and studied as a reproductive body with sort of countless biomedical research agendas focused on how women's age, health, behaviors, and exposures can affect reproductive outcomes, okay? So if you sort of think about gender and medical knowledge making, that when people are asking questions about health in general, they're studying male bodies. And when they're asking questions about reproduction, they're studying female bodies, right? That's the kind of basic social process that I am arguing is happening. And this is where I talk to you about why I'm using bathroom figures on purpose to talk about the ways that these approaches to the human body are sort of based on, and the foundation for these is a longstanding belief that human bodies come in just two flavors, right? Male and female, that these are understood as opposite sexes. And so that cultural belief in a gender binary is at the root of these medical knowledge making processes. And so I will come back to this point at the end, but I want to talk about, as we sort of continue to destabilize the notion that sex and gender are binary in any way, that this is really an important thing for thinking about reproductive politics and gender politics more generally. And I will just say here that I am saying male and female and men and women, but every time I say those words, please hear the following preamble, which is bodies historically categorized as male, or historically understood as male, right? Or people who identify as men, people who identify as women. So I'm not making any sorts of assumptions about the relationship between sex and gender and any other forms of identity. And so I want to be as inclusive as possible, but I don't want to say that preamble every single time. So hear it in your head. Okay, so in writing the book, I came to realize that these two claims about the male standard and the female reproductive body have sort of evolved somewhat separately in the literature. They're sort of almost these kind of truisms that we don't even really kind of question anymore. But I think once you put them next to each other, that's when we start to see how they can lead to tensions and gaps. And so the argument that I'm making in the book is that this has led to a gap in our knowledge about male reproductive bodies, okay? And that's because when we were asking questions about reproduction, we were only studying female bodies. So we get this gap about male reproduction. I'm just going to give you one other example of a gap that I think emerged because of this kind of approach to sexed and gendered bodies and medical knowledge making, which is that our understandings around cardiovascular disease were primarily based on studies of male bodies and men's experiences. And so we had a long-standing gap in that, we didn't understand that symptoms can look and feel different for people who were assigned female. Okay? And so it just gives you another example. I'm not going to talk about it in any more detail than that, but I don't think the argument I'm making is true only of male reproductive health. Okay, so I'm a sociologist. Here are my methods. I was looking at the production of non-knowledge, not only in terms of what kinds of knowledge making were happening around sperm. And so I looked at and here's where you have a moment from my research assistants. Journal of the American Medical Association articles on sperm from 1883, when it started being published, until 2014. A scientific literature review, documents on medical specialization. We had a similar sample of New York Times articles on sperm for 50 years. And then finally, these interviews with people about how they understand it. And so it's not only about, once the knowledge starts being made about sperm, the question is, does it circulate? And then how is it received? And that's sort of a sociology of culture approach to production, circulation, and reception, coming together with this kind of approach to non-knowledge. All right, so here's where we go back to the 1890s. So, put your seatbelts on, travel through time. The first question that I had was really, how did we get here to a male standard body and a female reproductive body? And I started hanging out with some of the medical historians at Yale, who gave me some, really wonderful help in terms of how to think about how to answer this question. And I ended up focusing on a little known, but what I came to call a really crucial moment in the 1890s. So the political scientists in the room, I think you all would call this a critical juncture. There was actually an attempt to launch a specialty for male reproductive health that was called andrology. So we're in the last few decades of the 19th century. The medical profession is still sort of becoming a profession. And it started to take the same shape that it holds to this day. And so these folks were arguing, there's so much information out there. There's so much we need to understand about the human body. We can't keep up. We should specialize. And so very early on, you get obstetrics and GYN as two of the earliest medical specialties. And they, kind of hive off knowledge about female bodies and reproduction from very early days and make it a separate kind of medical knowledge. And throughout the 20th century, there's infrastructure that gets built up about that. OB and GYN merge in the 1920s. They've got journals, they've got conferences, right? So we get the female contraceptive pill, IVF, all the reproductive technologies that only work on female bodies, right? So you can see this looping effect of the knowledge making and the technology and the infrastructure up until present day. Okay. So it's 1888 or 1889 or so. This physician, Edward Lawrence Keyes, was a professor of genitourinary surgery at Bellevue in New York City. So he's a very elite physician in the US. And he argues that he sends a bunch of letters, which I have looked at, to his colleagues and said, we need a parallel specialty to GYN, right? So here again, you hear that gender binary, sex binary happening, a parallel specialty to GYN so that we could put the diseases of men on as high a plane as GYN gynecology does for women. And he makes the argument that they should establish something called the American Association for Andrology. Unfortunately for them, male reproductive health at the time was mostly involved treating venereal disease, to use their language. Today we would call them sexually transmitted infections, syphilis and gonorrhea. And they were extraordinarily stigmatized. There was no obvious cure for these things. And that stigma extended to the physicians who would sort of deign to kind of specialize in this area. And they were so stigmatized because it involved sex outside of marriage, right? We're in the late 19th century. So these early andrologists, and you can see it in the pages of medical journals and in the transactions of medical conferences, were ridiculed for the idea that you would specialize in male reproductive organs. And so they were criticized both for their over specialization, but also their associations with immorality and quackery. So they quickly renamed their group the American Association for Genitourinary Surgery. And about 10 years later, in 1905, they try to cut out the genito and say, if you're working on genital organs, and I'm so sorry, I hope most of you are done with lunch, yes. If you're working on genitals or venereal disease, we don't want you at our conferences, we don't want you to publish in our journals. They become urologists. So this is why we have a specialty of urology, which sort of, some of them do a little bit on male fertility, but in no way, and they lament this to this day, are they a parallel specialty to OBGYN in terms of their numbers or their authority? So I'm getting a little bit ahead of the story. So 1890s, we're gonna jump into the 1960s. So you have essentially a market failure at the end of the 19th century, right? Men are half the population. You have widespread venereal disease that goes untreated, and yet they still can't establish a specialty. So 80 years goes by, and in 1969, a German dermatologist who specialized in venereal disease started a journal called Andrology. And this title says he introduces andrology as a new medical specialty in 1969. A year later, a Spaniard and an Argentinian found the International Society for Andrology. The American branch has its first meeting in 1975. You can see they've already incorporated sperm in their logo. It's still there to this day. And they had no idea that this was not the first attempt to launch a parallel specialty to GYN for andrology. And in fact, in the late 1980s, they find that op-ed in JAMA that I had up there from 1891, and they said, you could actually reprint this in full because all of the issues are the same, okay? So you have now a second attempt to launch a specialty with the same name and the same goals. I will say most people have never heard of andrology. Can you raise your hand if you'd heard of it before I just said it? Yes, okay, well, this is where I'm in a conference with, yes, a bunch of people working on reproductive health. Often people have never heard of this. And so this is just a Google Ngram to show you obstetrics, gynecology, urology, and andrology, which barely sort of takes off from the x-axis, about 10 or 15 years ago. And so I think the kind of comparative historical argument here about why it fails in the 1890s and at least partially succeeds in the 60s and 70s is that we have a whole bunch of social movements at that time for women's rights and patients' rights and men's rights. And I think that gives us new ways of thinking about gender, and bodies and medical knowledge, such that a specialty devoted to male reproduction at least becomes thinkable, right? Which it had not really been in the 1890s. It's also in the 1970s that biomedical researchers begin to pay more attention to male reproductive health. I think this is not a coincidence that you have many women entering the field, getting PhDs and starting to do research at the same time. I don't have enough data to definitively make that claim, but I'll say in the 1970s, we start to get the earliest sort of research about paternal effects and paternal age, behaviors, and toxic exposures. And so now there's sort of a small body of literature. It's constantly growing, but there's still not this infrastructure, right? We don't have andrological conferences and journals and societies. It's hard to find training if you're a clinician or a scientist. So we never built up that infrastructure around male reproductive health like we did for male reproductive health. And the result is that even, going through thousands and thousands of research studies and looking through, at least in the United States, all of these different federal agencies and medical associations, we looked through these websites in 2015 for any references to paternal effects. And there was either minimal or zero discussion. If they do talk about it, and they'll talk about male infertility, they'll talk about the importance of STIs, but they're not talking about the effects of male bodily health on reproductive outcomes. If they do, they almost always keep it to their effects on sperm. So sperm count, sperm motility, sperm morphology, but not the kind of epigenetic or genetic damage that can happen to sperm that can affect reproductive outcomes. The one exception is this one page on the entire CDC website, so the major sort of public health organ for the United States. They summarize paternal effects under the phrase men's preconception care, which nobody would Google ever. And essentially what they do, they don't even provide any of the detailed information. They took the female preconception care page, copy, pasted, and changed the pronouns, right? This is like the best that they had. And I don't think in the interim, it has gotten much better. You can also see it in this content analysis of New York Times articles, where we looked for any New York Times article that included the word sperm or cognates from 1968 to 2018, 50-year sample. You can see it's not zero, right? But on average, there are 3 articles per year. And there is no longitudinal increase is reporting alongside the longitudinal increase in scientific knowledge making as of 2005. And this history matters because that lack of a cohesive medical specialty is part of why there's been so little medical research and even less public health attention to men and their sperm. And so it's that void, right, that gap in knowledge making that raises questions that I tackle in the last part of the book. So here I draw on interviews with 40 men and 15 women drawn from a general community. So they're not visiting the doctor, they're not in any sort of reproductive site. They're just drawn from the general community. And I asked them 2 questions. How would you define a man's role in reproduction? And how did they react to learning some of this new information about paternal effects? Here again, I will just ask for like however many minutes I have left. Thanks. Okay, so like another 15. Okay, perfect, thanks. I should have written down whatever number I'm headed towards. I just didn't do that. I just wanna make sure that I save time for the complexity. So I'm gonna summarize this part very briefly, but I will say these were really, really interesting interviews to do, because if you ask men about how they would define their role in reproduction, you get long pauses. They look like this, right? A man's role in reproduction. Wow, a man's role. I never thought about that before. I don't think it'd be too different from a woman's role. What would my role be? Can you rephrase the question? So here, pauses and ums become data, right? So the pauses demonstrate for some people, they have no idea what to say. They've never thought about it before. Some of them were a little surprised by the question, so there is that. But we also don't have a readily accessible cultural script of what a man's role in reproduction is. So they stumble around a bit and eventually they get to, well, kind of a 3-part answer. Well, it involves having sex, providing sperm, and then being the father, right? And here this last answer I put up here, not because it's news to anybody, right? The provider, the caretaker, the supporter, that's what every man needs to do, right? That is a cultural script. There are no pauses. I heard something like that from almost everybody I interviewed, right? So they do have things to say about fatherhood, but not reproduction, which I think is very telling. And that's because, you know, we're not making knowledge about it. Their doctors aren't talking about it. The last time many of these men heard anything about their reproductive organs was in high school. And that's if they live in a place where we provide sex education, which we often don't in the US. I will just say also, not only in doing interviews do we need to be thinking about what we're hearing, but what do we not hear? And so what was missing in these interviews was any connection whatsoever between male bodily health and male reproductive outcomes. So people have not put sperm and reproductive outcomes together. And I saw that when I went, you know, like I said, I was looking for some sort of patient handout. The best I could find was that CDC website. So I made my own about healthy sperm, and I detail this in the book, and had people read through this about sort of paternal age, paternal exposures, et cetera, and then had them walk through not only how they would react, but then to get around sort of social desirability bias, because everybody says, well, of course I would do all those things, right? So then you say, well, imagine somebody imagine one of your friends, how would they react? And that's where you get the real answers. And the real answers were things about cultural norms of masculinity. Men think they're invulnerable, they would ignore this. I heard a lot of answers about the well-documented gap between health intentions and health behaviors, right? We all know we should do these things, but nobody's gonna do them. And then really importantly, so many of these interviewees pointed to structural and environmental threats to health, right? Which is something that we talk about in academia, but you know, it was really great to hear from individuals as well that, as one guy put it, there's a lot that stands between me and healthy sperm, right? And it includes things like healthcare inequalities, especially in the US, poverty, structural racism, chemicals at work, that if you're working in a low-wage job and somebody tells you to move that bucket of toxins from one place to another, you say no, and that's your job, right? Pollution, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think this is a really important kind of pushback to our more general understandings of sort of health as an individual level problem. Okay, so that gives you a super quick overview of the argument in the book. And the conclusions that I drew in the end of that, you know, research, which kind of took me through 130 plus years of history, is that I really kind of ended the books thinking, you know, we just need to pay more attention to male reproductive health, right? Like if I were going to turn it into a bumper sticker, that's what the bumper sticker would be. And for social scientists, this is an important case for thinking about how gender shapes the non-knowledge that we make. For biomedical researchers, if they're ignoring male bodies, which they do all the time in studies of reproductive risk, we are missing some unknown amount of risk that emanates from male aging, male health, et cetera. Healthcare providers need to incorporate men, people assigned male at birth, people who identify as men, into healthcare and in reproductive healthcare in particular, which I think is a really complicated thing to actually do. And then for those in public health, I think we need to take the newness of the idea of paternal effects and rethink our traditional approaches to public health messaging around reproduction, right? We need to avoid all the mistakes that we make about stigmatizing individuals and moralizing about health, and provide messaging and information in a way that understands that people are all trying to do the best they can and exist in structural and cultural circumstances that make it very, very difficult for many people to achieve health. So I don't want to just take all the anxiety that many women feel about reproduction and just spread that around. I think we should do this better for everybody. So those are the recommendations that came out of the book. And then, as you're probably already imagining, they're complicated, politically complicated, logistically complicated. And so as I wrote the book, it came out in August of 2020. There was a pandemic. There was another presidential election that was also terrifying in the US. And as the book came out and I started having conversations with students and colleagues and journalists, I just started to think about trying to figure out how to address the things that I didn't have answers for. And so that's where I teamed up with Lisa and Brian, who are in the front of this picture. And we organized a workshop. We wanted to keep it small. So we put out a public call for anybody doing work on sperm But like I said, we had people from so many different areas of, the social sciences and medicine, and legal scholars. And everybody had to write like if you're going to organize an interdisciplinary workshop, I so recommend this. Everybody had to write 1,000 words in order to walk in the door. And everybody else had to read everybody else's 1,000 words. And what that did was that the urologist and the anthropologist and the philosopher and the psychologist had to kind of come up with what it was they were thinking about when it comes to sperm health and politics. And everybody had read everybody else's. So we didn't have a lot of posturing. We didn't have long, windy statements about sort of what people thought or why they thought it. Everybody came in, and then we workshopped all 30 essays in one Saturday. And so as a result of the feedback, some people everybody revised their essays. Some people revised them a lot. We were never aiming for consensus, and we would not have gotten it. We couldn't even agree on, like I'll get to in a minute, on terms like male and men. And so this was a really generative, fascinating, difficult day. I mean, people were there, and they were there. People did come together, and they were able to have conversations. But it produced something that I would never have been able to anticipate. And so I highly recommend, this is why we say interdisciplinary work is so important. So the thing that I'm going to do in the next slide is that I've sort of grouped the issues and the complexities into 3 categories of social, clinical, and political. Of course, these are analytical distinctions. All of these areas are shaped by the others. But I just want to give you a flavor of the kinds of things that came out in those conversations and what we ended up writing the introduction to that book titled Seminal. And so if anybody's interested in it, I'm happy to send you a copy of the introduction. Okay, good. And I have enough time to get to all of these, which is great. That's what I was trying to do. All right, so in terms of complexities, I think first, and you've been hearing it throughout this talk, there's the question of how to even refer to the reproductive health of males, of using the adjective male without reifying the gender binary, right? Because if I just say reproductive health, people think women. So it's like you have to put that adjective there, but in doing that, it makes it a separate thing, right? It like reifies that binary. We actually started out by titling the workshop, our original call for papers was about male sexual and reproductive health. But then we were having these conversations and we got some feedback from people. So we tried to avoid the word male at all. And we just started talking about sperm. So the workshop became sperm, health, politics. And then the doctors really didn't like that because they're like, well, you're reducing people to just this body part and their whole entire, and I was like, yes, that is true. So I think this is sort of a live and important question. There's a lot of different approaches to it in the volume. We didn't try to standardize. There was consensus that we absolutely need more information and better clinical approaches about people who are trans and non-binary, because they need access to healthcare. They need access to healthcare that understands who they are and what they're trying to accomplish. And so in the United States, I mean, we've already seen so many legislative assaults on trans people and their health and their lives. And so I think this is only going to become more crucial, that those of us who are in academia who can do this work, we've got to keep doing this work. So there was consensus about that, but just not what we call it, right? I will also say that for most of this talk, I've focused on gender, but of course, we cannot think about gender in separation or isolation from other social inequalities around race, class, sexuality, ability, nationality, et cetera. And so there was a lot of effort among those in the workshop to think about sperm health politics, not only in terms of gender, but also in terms of these other intersecting inequalities. Crystal Littlejohn wrote an essay on stratified reproductive justice, sort of thinking about, do you take reproductive justice and just extend it to people who make sperm? Or does that complicate what reproductive justice is, which it absolutely does. So I'm really excited about that sort of conceptual contribution from her essay. In terms of clinical complexities, where and how do you fully integrate sperm and people who are assigned male at birth or people who identify as men into the provision of reproductive and sexual health care, given that it has so long been understood as a space for, even women's health, maternal health, female reproductive health, just the ways that those clinics are set up, the ways the doctors were trained, the ways the knowledge is made, you really have to figure out how do you enter into medical education, healthcare provision, public health messaging, and disrupt the established ways of doing things in order to think about the reproductive health of all bodies and not just people who were assigned female at birth. For example, men can easily go from their last pediatric checkup in their teens, right before they get a job or they go to college or they join the military. They see their pediatrician when they're 16 or 17 or 18, and there's just no reason for them to walk back into a doctor's office to have a general conversation until they're getting a colonoscopy in their 40s or 50s. Right? They're not being told to go to the doctor for preventive healthcare in the way that women are. So I think this actually might not even, I think we need to think beyond the medical profession. I think we need to be thinking about high school teachers teaching sex ed and health where that is still done. And whether or not, where to put that. Okay, I'm still gonna run over time just by a minute or two. We also had debates about whether or not you kind of create a separate specialty for male reproductive health. Like as we've seen historically, there have been these attempts to do. Based on my historical research, I think that's the wrong move, right? Reproductive health is technically a gender neutral term. It has not been understood or promulgated in that way, but it is technically gender neutral. I think reproductive health providers are already starting to extend that umbrella to trans and non-binary people. And I think we just need to keep going. I think we need to include people assigned male at birth and people who identify as men, and think about the reproductive health of everyone, right? Whether or not they're currently reproducing or planning to ever reproduce, right? We can still be thinking about the health of all bodies. All right, at the same time, we also have to be really careful about the effects of any sort of health discourse or medicalization, which we know from decades of public health and social scientific research focuses our attention at the level of individual bodies and individual behaviors and crowds out these really important considerations of structural and environmental causes of disease. This leads to blaming and stigmatizing people, especially from marginalized communities. And so we've got to work to avoid that as we sort of take reproductive health and try to expand it to include additional people. And then I will put this in last but not least, and I will say, I developed these slides before the election, so I'm just really, really feeling this last one. There is the current state of reproductive politics. And what does it mean? Of course, here I'm thinking especially of the US, and like I said, Canada, learning this morning about all the ways that you are doing this so much better than we are. What does it mean to focus on male reproductive health at a time when the most basic rights to reproductive autonomy are under severe threat for those who are or could become pregnant? I think that's a real question. I spent 10 years and I've written now 2 books about this. I still don't know the answer to this question. I'm going to come back to what I said right at the beginning. I think it is crucial for reproductive politics and gender politics to think about male reproductive health, to incorporate male reproductive health, to talk about it. But at the same time, in every single conversation I have, whether I'm talking to students, reporters, I'm like, here is the bright line. It doesn't matter what we say about sperm. You always have to come back to the person who is or could be pregnant having the last word. And I think that's where I will stop. Thank you. There you go.
I think I can figure the microphone out. I'm hoping I can. Rene, thank you so much. You couldn't see, but at several points during your presentation, I had either a smile or a grimace or things of that nature. Being someone who has the anatomical components that you're talking about, part of my facial expressions are related to that. But more importantly, being a cisgender gay man who is from the United States and has had the opportunity to work with a large number of folks from vastly different cultural backgrounds, Um, one of the things that comes to my mind is really thinking about when you're talking about the pauses with the interviewers. Who was doing the interviews? What was the gender of the people doing the interviews?
Yep. So I did the majority of them. So I think I did 30 of them. And then I was interested in this exact question. So I hired 2 research assistants, one who is a cis man, and I wanted him to do a good number of the interviews so I could see if there were differences. And there's actually a literature in the social sciences that's called Gender of Interviewer Effects, if you're interested in looking this up. And generally they find that there's not huge effects, but sometimes there are. And I was like, I am a cis woman interviewing men about their sperm. But I was actually surprised that there was not a huge distinction between the results that I had in my interviews and what my RA did. Oh, that's where I should actually, I'll just say thank you to all my research assistants and the funders. So Todd ended up, his interviews were a little bit shorter than mine. So people talked to me a little bit longer, which could make sense. I've been interviewing people about sperm for a while. And we also both heard, like one of the things that we did in the analysis was looking at people's sort of gender egalitarianism and how that affects how they talk about the relationship between eggs and sperm, which was another question that I didn't have time to get to. And we both heard some pretty misogynistic things. I heard them in my interviews and he heard them in his. So I was compelled that, the interviews that I had done were not dramatically different than if they had been performed by somebody else. But in sociology, where the researcher is the research instrument, right? When we're doing qualitative interviews, yourself is always in the data in some way and in ways you can't necessarily know. It was an important question to me as well.
Yeah, and so really thinking about the geography where this occurred and that it was, I'm assuming, in the New Haven or greater New York area.
City in the United States with a large university.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Not to reveal any names or anything, but we'll just leave that out. I have a lot of other questions, but I really want to give folks in the audience an opportunity to ask questions as well. Please, Michelle.
I don't think so. I can hear you. Yeah, so these are the interviewee demographics. And so I don't know if that's too small for you to see in the back, but I interviewed men and women who were between 18 and 49 for men and 29 and 39 for women. So they were, they were people of reproductive age, kind of using those categories. About half were white, half were people of color. About half were lower SES, so lower levels of education, working in low-wage jobs. Half of the people were higher SES, half of them were parents, half of them were not. I have a subsample of people who identified as gay or men who had sex with men. I guess, yes, now this says Yale study. And so you can see that this was in a northeastern city. The interviews were done between 2014 and 2016. So I had men of really different, I had 18-year-olds who were working in their first job. I had a 49-year-old man who was a grandfather. So there were generational differences even in the sample. But your question is more generally about, would the younger generation, demographers will tell us that with every passing generation, people do evince more gender egalitarian beliefs. There are higher levels of education. Those are also associated with gender egalitarianism. So there is sort of a general expectation that people would think differently about gender. And I think that often extends to thoughts about reproduction. But I will have to say again, watching, the American election in the last week, you have a huge number of college students who are voting conservatively. And so I will probably be a little more pessimistic about how I answer that question once I see, I mean, they're still sort of crunching the numbers, but I don't think we can necessarily rely on generational change to fix reproductive and gender politics. I think we have to do that work. Right.
I can't. Oh,
It's
maybe. Thank you very much. This is super interesting. I have a question, sort of things or trends that you think might be happening more recently. So one of the things we've been talking about earlier today is issues around access to IVF. And there's been some politicization of IVF, which fits under that broader reproductive health. And, I'm also speaking more just of sperm, but there's male factors for infertility that lead to IVF. And so that is an issue that's impacting men. And there's also more on the environmental side of things about microplastics and things like that, where there's more of like an environmental link to male fertility. And I've been seeing a lot in that in the media. So I'm just wondering how you see those different discussions impacting maybe attention to this going forward.
Yeah, thank you for that. So I think there's a couple of different ways to kind of come at that question. And so, I mean, the kind of first thought I had was, as we've seen sort of efforts to assign personhood to embryo, I mean, there's been longstanding efforts to assign personhood to fetuses, and now we're seeing it in the embryos. I've had questions about whether or not we're going to see any sort of efforts to assign any kind of personhood or higher level of status to eggs and sperm when they're still not fused. That there are discourses in the sort of men's rights movements about sort of the importance of the sperm that they're growing. And I can completely imagine saying, well, if I spend all this time to grow this healthy sperm and I provide it to somebody who is then carrying that, you could make arguments then about, well, then they should have some say over whether or not that person has access to abortion. So I do think the kind of cultural power of sperm, the way it's sort of always been laden with masculinity in the way that it has, would make me unsurprised if you start seeing claims about people who are producing, high quality sperm and what kind of rights that should give them. Here is where I'm like, now there's a whole bunch of lawyers in the room. There's probably reasons to think that might be a little paranoid, but I don't, I think I'm fine to be more paranoid than not in this particular moment. So that's one way to think about your question. So you mentioned IVF. I think something that I don't know if we're going to see it on the panel tomorrow with sort of new reproductive technologies, but also IVG, so in vitro gametogenesis, which is a technology that has not yet been successfully done, but there's a lot of work being done on this. And this is where you grow a gamete with any skin cell, right? And so that would be, they are thinking of it as a potential fertility treatment. So you wouldn't have to go get an egg donor or a sperm donor. You would just grow your own gamete from your own cells. I have a graduate student who's doing a dissertation on trans reproduction, and they have been interviewing trans adults about IVG and their sort of excitement about this as a potential technology for trans people. It would increase access for LGBTQ people, potentially, again, who need gametes of the quote unquote other sex. So I think that there's a lot that is happening that is beyond our sort of standard topics of abortion, contraception, reproductive technologies, new reproductive technologies, but also then the ways that sort of people from these kind of various social groups are thinking about putting those technologies into practice. Yeah, thank you.
Well, you know my work. And so you guys will hear from me tomorrow. I do serial sperm donation. So I've done deep dives historically into traditionally, medical practices surrounding sperm donation and limits and things like that. So I've run into, in my own research, a mystery that I can't get anyone to solve. And I think you're the closest outside, of us as a psychology PhD. So we have all these ideas of how it's normal, quote unquote, to have sex or get turned on or play with others sexually or intimately. And we have all these ideas of what's deviant or non-normal, right? And in these classifications, we have, foot fetishes. We have men who have sex with women who are pregnant. And we have men who have sex with women for the purposes of conceiving. So it's like the conception fetish, the pregnancy fetish. Those are recognized and documented in psychological literature. But when I talk about, having lots of children, number one, if I talk about it with men, it seems to be something that they are really attracted to. Like, oh, I can see the attraction of spreading my sperm around. But so the sex is there, but there's no conception of fatherhood, right? So it seems to be a similar gap like you discuss between the sexual act and the roles that one plays in fatherhood. There is absolutely nothing in the literature on sexual philias about, or fetishes, about having large numbers of children and in whose lives you play no role as a male. And so I've always been curious why that was the case, because we have historical examples where people did that. Is it under power or control or a search for immortality? But it seems like there's a sexual component to it too. So, mystery.
Okay, really interesting question. I think the way that I would come at that, so I heard, I interviewed for my first book 20 sperm donors about how they decided to become sperm donors and what their experiences were. And of those 20 people, I heard sentiments like that from 2 of them. In interviewing 40 men for this more recent study, men from the general community, none of them had been involved with sperm donation. One of them had been to a fertility clinic, but they were not people who were sort of thinking about reproduction. As you see on the recruitment slide, I didn't say anything about reproduction or sperm or fatherhood. Like, I did not want people who were thinking about those things. So I too have heard those sentiments. I cannot think of a study that sort of systematically has recruited men who want to have a whole lot of children that they have genetically contributed to but do not have a role in their lives. I think we see some of that in some of the sperm donor literature, but also I think we're also not necessarily asking people those questions directly. So maybe it's bubbling up and there would be more there if we asked directly about it. So I think it's an interesting potential site for further empirical study of like how many people, and I would be interested, are there any people who make eggs who think in these terms, right? I wouldn't say that it's probably just something that, especially now that you can provide eggs through egg banks and other ways. I will take just a step back and say, in terms of sort of a social scientific perspective, one book that I found really helpful is the anthropologist Matthew Gutmann has a book that's called Fixing Men. And the introduction to that book, and it's interviews with men in Mexico about vasectomies and various other sort of reproductive topics. But the introduction to that book is super helpful because he takes on the notion that men are sort of driven by biological urges, which is sort of what you were just, I think that's what you were kind of hinting at, was sort of how people sort of think about sexual activity. But he was talking about the sort of cultural construction of men as being driven by biology, which is it's an argument, it's a belief. It's not necessarily rooted in empirical truth. But that belief has sort of foreclosed a whole lot of research about the social production of male sexualities of all kinds. And so I would say, yes, I think it'd be interesting to find, people and interview them about if they do want large numbers of children and how they think about that. But I would also think about it as sort of the social and cultural production of that desire. Right. Thank you.
Last question.
Great, thanks. And I apologize for the question if you might not want it, but in November 2024, I just can't help but come back to the election. And in your complexities, I was thinking about the Democratic campaign really trying to play male reproduction in some way. And there are those really striking advertisements that they ran where they were, I don't know if others had seen these pieces, and it wasn't men as allies. Like that was one piece, but it was really kind of showing male identified people as having this place in reproduction and reproduction being this national issue. And so what happened with that in some way? And of course, not a diagnosis of the election overall, but I think it was something at least I hadn't seen before in US national politics that way. And yeah, I wondered for your thoughts on it.
So I live in Connecticut, which is a blue state. And so we actually, and I don't have a TV, so I did not see any ads. I can sort of I just don't want to assume which ads you're talking about. So you're thinking about like Tim Walz and providing tampons, or
No, I was
talking about,
thinking even of the ads where it's, like having that it's an ad having sex, a man and a woman. And then in the moment they say, hey, look, abortion won't be legal. How do you feel about that? But they ask it to the man in the moment of having sex. And so it's this kind of moment of flipping what would have otherwise been, as you said before, a women's issue, and making the criminalization of abortion from a point of view of paternal rights, or the idea of fatherhood when you don't want it, as being the issue. Yeah. Or other ways when it's a pregnancy, and again, being unable to have obstetric emergency care. And they, again, locate it with the man, or in this case, the potential father, as, again, having, in that case, I remember a specific discussion with the, quote, male legislator. And so it's really, kind of fascinating, I think, because it wasn't ally, that way of thinking.
Yeah.
It was about locating a man in these reproductive acts.
That is so interesting. So I think if there are any graduate students in the room looking for dissertation topics, there you go. I think that, so maybe the point is to take the bullet point about sort of how to think about, as I'll take a word from your introduction, sort of male positionality or men's positionality in these debates, that there can be quite a lot of variation. And it can be towards a more progressive sort of kind of positionality. Like one of the sort of political cartoons that I saw was a dad standing with their kid at the voting booth and was filling out a ballot for Harris, looking at his daughter and saying, I'm voting for you, right? And so there was also that kind of story about masculinity. Tim Walz was talking about his fertility treatments and providing tampon, like a football coach in the Midwest who started the first gay-straight alliance at his high school. These are just, it was incomprehensible to think that there would be somebody on the Democratic ticket who would be a man who would be talking in those terms. So I think, the 2024 election, like when we get a little bit of distance, I think there's going to be a lot there to talk about in terms of different modes of masculinity, different sort of ways that people were positioned in that. So it's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Renee. And thank you all for sticking around and enjoying our time together.
So much.